Hey everybody, welcome to our breakout session here at the International Friends Church Multiplication Conference 2022. That's a long beginning. I want to talk today about post-pandemic pathways to multiplication. My name is Stetzer. I'm a missiologist, so I think in terms of things of missiology. So missiology is a discipline that helps people to understand the cultural moment, to engage new cultures, things of that sort. And so I'm going to talk some about three ongoing realities. But before we get there, I'm actually going to take us through some rethinking of pandemics as well. This has been a real time of shaking. We all feel that Hebrews 12:27, so that what cannot be shaken may remain. This has been a time of shaking, yet we've clung to the Lord, rightly so, His work. The moment we're in does not pause the mission we're on. And so, but we've got to acknowledge that we've actually been walking through a few years that's unlike anything we've seen in our lifetime. Now, of course, we all know the pandemic, but I actually think we're walking through a series of pandemics. I actually talk about 6 pandemics in particular. One, obviously, is a pandemic of disease, which has impacted people in our different time zones in different ways, maybe in surprising ways. And people say, well, I didn't expect it to be this, or expect it to be less of this, or more of that. But certainly this has been the greatest global crisis in our lifetime. It's impacted the health of millions of people. And the reality is it's here to stay. And, depending on, when you pre-record something, you don't know if that means that by the time this comes out, we're in a new wave. We don't know. But what we also seen is it's not just about disease. What we're going through a series of pandemics, and the way we use the word pandemic means more than just disease for most people. There are pandemics of other things. So for example, we're in a pandemic of distrust in culture. All around the world, people have lost levels of trust for one another. There's a greater sense of division. There's a greater sense of, I don't believe you. I'm not sure I want to be in the same context with you. Now again, it's very difficult to talk all the time zones that are represented here in the International Friends world because it's different in different places. But we see this distrust in the Philippines. We see it in Brazil. We see it in India. We see it around the world. And we can acknowledge that it's real and there are ramifications for the kind of ministry and mission God has called us to. There's another pandemic of defamation from technology. It's people can just say anything they want about other people and about institutions and organizations on social media. And we're all just one moment away from a crisis. And sometimes we get used to it because people are always yelling on social media. But technology has just accelerated the ability for people to be aggressively critical, which again, I think flattens and enables people to have accountability. I think accountability is good, but also too, just to say whatever they want to say. There are ramifications of that are making it a challenge to do ministry around the world. And again, it's different in different places. If you're, I shouldn't mention countries where there's persecution, but if you're in a place where there's persecution, someone can post, those Christians did so-and-so, and the next thing you know, there's a crowd outside your church or your home. And it looks different in different places, but this defamation reality of technology is a pandemic in our culture. There's a pandemic in disorientation and identity. Who are we? And depending on where you are in the world, in the Western world, some of that conversation is about gender and sexuality. Other places in the world, it might be who we are, who we want to be, what kind of person do we want to be, what kind of nation we want to be. But there's a pandemic of disorientation, people unsure who they are, where they're going, and what they want to be. There's a pandemic of disruption to mental health. We care deeply as followers of Jesus about people, and mental health is a central part of who they are. And I don't even think we've seen fully what the mental health ramifications will be in the last few years. It'll take a decade or two to see this fully. And may we as followers of Jesus rush in and show and share the love of Jesus to people who are hurting emotionally, psychologically, mentally. And then there's a pandemic of division in churches. All around the world, people are telling me that they're experiencing some division in churches. Now again, I shouldn't say too strong all around the world, in many places around the world. It's not everywhere, but it's consistent in many, many places. But those are not the 3 things that I want to talk about. But I want to kind of frame a little bit around this so you get a general picture of some of the pandemics in culture. I've listed 6 here. I've written about this too. If you want to Google my name, Ed Stetzer, and 6 pandemics, you'll find an article I wrote about this in a magazine where I serve as an editor-in-chief called Outreach Magazine. So it's online, so you can find that there if you want to dig a little deeper in that. But some of them relate. And so there are three big things I want to talk about today. Three big things I want to talk about today related to our post-COVID reality. And the first is COVID and our cultural convulsion. COVID and our cultural convulsion. It seems that every few decades, the world goes through a tumultuous and turbulent time. And we would also recognize that that is different in different places. So I don't want to put a timetable on it. I would say where I'm from, it seems that about every 60 years, where I'm from seems to go through a tumultuous and turbulent time. So we see it now, we saw it in the 60s, but others of you are from different places, and you've seen much more turbulence in the 80s, you've seen much more turbulence in the 30s. But it seems that there's a cyclical reality. Mark Twain once said that history doesn't repeat itself, but it tends to rhyme. And every few decades, we go through a time and a season where there's a lot of cultural turbulence. And here we are in 2022, and it's probably unlike anything you've seen in your lifetime, depending on where you are. And again, there's political division, there's war, there's economic challenges, in a way that, to be fair, in past pandemics, often has been accompanied by economic challenges or collapse, war and more. So these things tend to come in sets. They tend to come related to one another. But if you had said in 2019 that this is what the world was going to look like in 2022, I don't think a lot of people would have believed you. Futurists refer to this as a black swan event. A black swan's super rare. And when you see it, it's like there's something like you didn't expect to see. Well, the pandemic was a black swan event, but it was stepped into a world that was already deeply divided and seems to have accelerated that division. So we have two things going on. There's a cultural convulsion. This is all under the COVID and our cultural convulsion. There's a cultural convulsion, unlike anything we've seen in our lifetime, that maybe we weren't prepared for. And if you went into the pandemic without reservoirs of resilience, you quickly found those reservoirs drained. And a lot of people have struggled, and a lot of pastors have struggled. But COVID and our cultural convulsion also speaks to a cultural acceleration. We're, in many places, civilizations are unsure about other ways of thinking and doing and being. We're in a civilizational struggle at times. People are having different visions of what the future should look like and what's right and what's wrong and what's bad and what's good. But that's what a cultural convulsion looks like. And when they come, people tend to look at one another, often turn at one another, not believe one another, not sure they want to be in community with one another. And I don't know where that ends. I'm not sure. I can't predict the future. I don't know where that goes. But I think that we're not through it, and probably not even mostly through it. When we see in the past, these things can last, depending upon if there's a accompanying, significant war, or how long a pandemic lasts. These things tend to have seemed to last in the past, maybe 4 to 6 years. Again, it's very difficult to generalize because we're talking so many time zones around the world. But if we're halfway through, I'd be surprised. I think it's going to get worse before it gets better. I don't want to bring anyone down. I think it's going to get worse before it gets better. It's going to get harder before it gets easier. And we're going to need reservoirs of resilience to make it through as followers of Jesus, as church leaders, in the next few years. So I think one of the key things to remember is in difficult times is often when the gospel is advanced. So I want you to be encouraged that hard times often produce gospel advance. But I also want you to be realistic. It's probably going to be a hard few years still to go ahead of us in the midst of our cultural convulsion. But it's also accelerating. So there's a cultural convulsion and accelerating, but people are accelerating in different ways. Some people say we should go this way. Some people say we should go that way, and are very aggressive about how and why we should go those directions. So the division is accelerating and increasing rather than decreasing. So again, I don't want to discourage you. I just think that we have to be aware and honest about some of what's going on. So the second thing is COVID and what I call the great sort. And this is where there's always been division in our culture. There's always been people who sort of find their own sources of truth and disagree with other people and live in their own kind of segmented reality. But that's changed in a lot of ways. And I think one of the ways that that's changed is because of technology. Let me show you a very significant piece of technology that kind of changed the ancient world. This is actually a pipe. And you can tell some things about the pipe. For example, it's not welded, but it's folded. So 2,000 years ago, the Romans in the Roman Empire they used these pipes to have hot and cold running water in Rome. 1 million people in Rome, because of the technological just marvel that Rome was. Roman roads, Roman aqueducts, and Roman pipes. The technology made it possible to have hot and cold running water and more. And they had this, they found/made, there's a process to this metal, and the metal was foldable, like it's folded here in this pipe. You can look closely, you'll see the pipe is folded over. It was moldable, the technical term is malleable. So they would take this metal and they made the pipes out of it, but it was such a remarkable thing. They made cups out of it, they made plates out of it. So their water was coming in through these pipes into cups that was made of this metal that they would drink from, plates that they would eat from. And the only problem was this metal is, well, it's called lead. And we know today of the deadly effects of lead in our water and in our food. So this technology was feeding them and killing them at the same time. It was miraculous and it was dangerous at the same time. And I think the same is true with this technology that I can hold right here in my hand. It's pretty amazing. I can look right now and I see my daughters have texted me and I can actually look on social media and see what people are saying about this or that. I can search for wonderful things. It's pretty amazing. People email me far too much on this and I email them back far too much. But this piece of technology, and it's only about 10 years that this was all brought together, that these phones, and our smartphones are different depending on where we are, but 10 years ago, we had a flashlight, we had a compass, we had a calculator, right? So all these things are gone now because they're all on here and more. So it's a remarkable technology that's changed everything, but we also know that it has some really dark impact. We see that young adults, students, teenagers, who engage social media at a particular higher level are dealing with depression at a higher level, self-harm at a higher level. We see that it's actually what I call, again, we'll come back to the point, the great sort. So what's happening is people are actually being so influenced by their social media, which until 10 years ago wasn't on your phone. Don't miss that. So 10 years ago, I was on social media, I don't even know, 25 years ago, but it wasn't like this. And now that it's on your phone, and you can actually scroll, right? We scroll now. So, and if you ever notice that if you scroll on whatever social media platform you use, it never ends. It's the never-ending scroll, and people call it doom scrolling because they just see all the bad news. But one of the things that the people who do this technology found is that if you want people to come back, the algorithm actually brings them back. The algorithm is like the mathematical tool that says what people should see. So the algorithm brings them back when they're angry, when they find people like them who might feel the same and often anger. And the end result is that people are now sorting themselves according to trends or ideologies that they found on social media. They're being discipled by this. They're being discipled by their social media in ways that have ramifications for the churches in a stunning way. So you might look and say, well, I see this in Kenya in the recent elections, right? Okay. So we saw that social media played such a significant part. Okay. But what does that have to do with the church? Well, what's happening is the great sort where people are sorting themselves ideologically is also impacting churches around the world. In the place where people are saying, well, why isn't my pastor talking about this? Or why is my pastor talking about that? Because I'm seeing on social media, or maybe it's a news channel or whatever, and it's everywhere, and people see it all the time. And maybe we're discipling them an hour a week, maybe 2 hours a week, or maybe 3 if they're going to a small group. And what's in their hand is discipling them 20 to 30 hours a week, and it's spiritually shaping them, and it's sorting them. So what's happening is people around the world used to be able to be in churches where we might disagree with some things in culture, there might be division in culture, but in the church, Jesus was our Lord. We could disagree on some of those political things, we could disagree on some of those ideological things, but Jesus was our Lord. And today, it's harder and harder, and all around the world, we've felt some of the division in our churches. Different levels, different countries, right? We know that that's not true everywhere at the same level. But this technology, I think, is hurting. It's also a remarkable thing, but it's hurting. I'm not saying I literally held up my phone, my smartphone, but I think for us, it reminds us that part of our cultural reality is, and part of this was during COVID, people just engaged technology at a much, much higher level. But it doesn't end there. Let's continue to walk through, and let's talk about the third thing is COVID and layers of engagement and disengagement. So all around the world, all the time zones engage with us. Churches have been impacted in some way. And what we found in most countries, now again, we don't have like a global survey, but we found in most countries is that all over the place, there's been a decline in church attendance that sometimes related to COVID. Now, we should say all over the place. In many places, that's the case. That maybe depending on the country, maybe you're back at 90%, maybe you're back at 95%, maybe you're back at lower than that. We've seen, depends on where you are too. Africa is different than Europe, and Asia is different than South America and North America. But here's what, and I'm going to just give a little example of what we're seeing in the Western world, because I have data for that. And then we'll see how it maybe relates to your situation as well. So people are engaging and disengaging in different places and at different levels. So depending on where you are in the world, your best church members will sit somewhere in your church. Let's say it's a church of 100 people. And in some cultures, your best, most involved church members sit in the front. And we call that the front third of the church, right? So 33 people on a given Sunday, 100 people there, 33. And let's think of ourselves as one of those cultures where the most engaged and involved people sit at the front. That's not my culture, by the way. My culture, some of the most engaged and involved people sit in the back. I don't like it, but some of you are like, how could this be? But it is. So let's be in a culture where the front third are the most engaged and involved. And then the middle third are sort of, another 33, and then the back third's another 33. So think 33, 33, 33. So what we seems to have happened in many places, and again, I'm specifically talking about some research in the West where I live, what we found is that the front third of the church seems to have gotten more engaged and more involved the last couple of years, which is significant to note. So a lot of churches have maybe their giving has been sustained, maybe even greater than 2019. Not everybody, again, there's not one experience around the world. But in our context, the front third has gotten more engaged and more involved, and thank God for that. We want more, not less. We want to normalize engaged and involved people. So the middle third is pretty much similar to what they were pre-COVID. They kind of hung on. They maybe some of them were impacted by the great sort. Maybe some of them left their church because they didn't like their church talking about this and not talking about that. But the back third is where a lot of the shifting has taken place. Most of the people who have left churches were loosely connected, based our data thus far in the West, were loosely connected to the church. So let's, again, think of a church of 100, 33, 33, 33. So that back third is 33 people, right? So if that back third is 33 people, and that's the least involved people, those people tend to come, and it's different in different cultures, but they tend to come Christmas, Easter, 3, 5, 7 other times a year. So they were loosely connected already. And what has happened is there's been a shift, a significant substantive shift, but overwhelmingly in that back third. So people who are loosely connected have often disconnected, sometimes completely, and perhaps permanently. So that has a lot of ramifications, particularly for evangelism, because and it depends on the culture and the religious background of the nation. But in many cultures, particularly people who come to faith in Christ, already start having a loose connection to the church already. They're checking it out. They're considering it. Maybe they were coming Christmas, Easter, 3, 5, 7 other times. But now we're loosely connected. Now they are perhaps permanently disconnected. So think in terms of the front third being more engaged and involved, the middle third hanging on, and the back third disengaged. And the ramifications of that can be substantial. Now, I want you to know, I'm not discouraged by the state of our world. I mean, there's discouraging things. And I probably stay perpetually encouraged because I've read the end of the book and Jesus wins. So I know that, in the Lord's goodness. But I think, there's that reference in Esther 4:14 that says, who knows, perhaps you have come to your royal position, but perhaps we've come to this moment for such a time as this. As we're here in the International Friends Church Multiplication Conference, we're asking, how do we join Jesus on mission? How do we live out those teachings of the Great Commission? How do we live out the mission of Jesus in our context? And I think ultimately that a post-pandemic missiology helps us to think about that, right? So we're thinking about this what are we looking like on the other side? Recognizing that, what does post even mean? I get it. But for a lot of us, we sort of, we had to adopt, in different places, in different countries, it was a different experience. It's very difficult to generalize about what everybody did during the pandemic. But in a lot of places, we adopted a temporarily deficient ecclesiology in the emergency for the sake of the mission. So depends on where you are, right? Depends upon, in some places, churches paused meeting because of government mandate. And in most places, for some season, I mean, it wasn't just churches, it was theaters, it was whatever, paused. And depending how long was depending on your country. So I can't say that, well, this was a month or 5 months or a year. I mean, in some places it was way longer. In some places it was way less. In some places there was no government directive or mandate. But in many places we said, let's temporarily be deficient, means lacking of something in our ecclesiology. Now, ecclesiology is the theology of church. So we said we're going to temporarily adopt a less than best, a not optimal experience of church, because church shouldn't just be in electrons and avatars through our devices. Church community, proximate community like church requires feet and faces, not just electrons and avatars. So we adopted this. We said we're going to temporarily do this. Maybe it was by government mandate. And again, I also know that people have strong opinions about this. So I'm just describing, I'm not telling you what you should have done or what you shouldn't have done. But it was in the emergency for the sake of the mission. So people said, we're going to pause this. But part of the challenge, I think, is that the end result is particularly depending on where you are, some people, pastors can be very encouraging. And I thank God for encouraging pastors. And some pastors said, listen, this is not a big deal. The church is never closing. We're just going online. But it really is a big deal. Part of what we are as a church, and part of who we are as the people of God, is a people who are in community together. And for 2,000 years, there have been times, and in the past, think about times when the plague swept through the world, churches, people knew, they didn't know what a virus was or a bacteria was, but they knew that if I go near other people, I get sick and I can die. So churches did take precautions. And at the same time, they recognized just with the joy when they could regather safely. And I think that's a key thing for us, is that moving forward, I think there are some principles that we need to think about how to look to multiplication post-COVID. And let me just put a couple of them up and then we'll talk through them. One is we need to elevate your ecclesiology, and the second is to engage the mission. I'll walk through both of those. So elevate your ecclesiology and engage the mission. So ecclesiology is our theological understanding of church. And one of the things we learned is that depending upon the denominational tradition, the Friends is a denominational tradition, my denomination is a denominational tradition, some have a very robust understanding, a very bodily view of gathering. We need one another. Maybe it involves the Lord's Supper. Maybe it involves some sort of community that's physically proximate. Some denominations have a strong or an elevated ecclesiology, and others have a lower ecclesiology. Maybe it's kind of loose. Maybe I come to church. Maybe I won't. One of the things that we learned is that we need to elevate our ecclesiology across and around the world. We need to teach things like Ephesians 3:10. God has chosen the church to make known his manifold wisdom. Or Galatians, bear one another's burdens and thus fulfill the law of Christ. Or Acts 2:42 through 47. And they devoted themselves to the apostles' teaching, to the breaking bread of prayer. And many signs and wonders were done. And they had all things in common. We need a greater community, a greater koinonia, to use the Greek term for fellowship that's much more than just fellowshipping over a meal. We need, coming out of COVID, a church that is much more deeply vested in one another than they were before. And so is that possible? Actually, yes. Because if we can normalize the front third, remember, the front third, if we can normalize the front third where people are engaged, they're serving more, they're generous, they're giving more, they're engaged more. And I think COVID has sort of led some people to step up, step out, stand in the gap, show and share the love of Jesus. If we can normalize that, not go back to maybe the second third that's like pre-COVID, but say, let's do this a different way. Part of what that can and should involve is the kind of biblical community that's more than consumer Christianity. Consumer Christianity is the idea that, in fact, I want to go to church if it meets my needs, right? Got a great church, I like the music, maybe I like the preaching, then I'll go. And I get it. I know your pastors and church leaders, and you're not in favor of that, but we can cater to that. We can become the shopkeepers at the religious store and try to provide something for the customers. And what I want to say is, let's elevate our ecclesiology and call people to a different way and to a better way. And I think the potential is great if we'll do that. I think if we were to say, and can say, and will say, that we're going to take this COVID moment, normalize the people who got more engaged and more involved, and actually seek to have a church that's more faithful and fruitful on mission, I think that makes a big difference. Now, that has a lot of ramifications for church planting, because what does that mean? Well, part of what we want to do is plant more and better churches. We want to evangelize new churches into existence. We want to be engaged with churches that plant churches that plant churches. And if COVID has done anything, it's disrupted the patterns. And maybe in the disruption of that pattern, we can say we need a higher level of ecclesiology, but also too, it's an acknowledgement that missions or evangelism should be deeply connected to the multiplication of churches, not just churches, right? We want to multiply everything. I talked about this in the prior international conference. We want to multiply disciples, groups, ministries, and churches, right? Disciples, groups, ministries, and churches. And certainly that was all impacted by the COVID shutdowns, economic distress, and more. So what does that look like for us, right? So if we're going to see a higher ecclesiology, we're going to see the church as a key place where all those kinds of multiplication strategies take place, and we're going to elevate that ecclesiology, okay? And the second thing is to engage the mission. This was a big part of my theme in the last time I was with you. And to engage the mission means to join Jesus on his mission, to say to the Lord, again, here I am, Lord, send me, and to ultimately see the mission as that which, well, drives us as followers of Jesus. Now, this is a different way of thinking, but perhaps COVID has helped us to think better. You say, how? I've written a book called Viral Churches, which in hindsight is not the best title, but we didn't have COVID pandemic. And in Viral Churches, we talked about churches multiplying like a virus, right? So again, wouldn't use that title in 2022, but 7 years ago, it seemed quite clever, and the publisher was quite pleased with doing so. But I've written a lot on this. I was just looking at, I wrote my first book almost 20 years ago on planting churches. It was called Planting New Churches in a Postmodern Age, 2003. And in there, I talked a lot about churches leaving the building. That's how I did a sermon series at a church called The Church Has Left the Building in, 10 years ago. Whole series, developed it into a book I ended up writing. Anyway, the thing is the idea of the church leaving the building has been something that we want churches on mission. That means leaving the inward focused reality. Now, it doesn't mean to devalue, because remember we started with elevate your ecclesiology. It doesn't mean to devalue the gathering of God's people, the small community that's there, partaking in the Lord's Supper and baptism and all those things. It doesn't mean to devalue those things. But it also reminds us that the church, in leaving the building, joins Jesus on his mission. So we can simultaneously elevate our ecclesiology and engage the mission. The church has left the building. So there's a certain irony. I wrote a whole sermon series, I think a chapter once on the church leaving the building in a book. And it seems like all the churches in the world left the building in early 2020. Some have remained that outward focus. And so thankful for friends, churches around the world that have, again, stood up, stood out, stood in the gap, are showing and sharing the love of Jesus. Their churches became just engaged in the ministry and serving communities when times when people were afraid or alone, the economic distress and more. Thank God for that. My own church, where I live, High Point Church, engaged and involved. We started staging areas, the place where people came in. We used to be welcoming areas. They were staging areas to serve the hurting, to provide food to those without, right? So thank God for that. So it is not a contradictory reality to elevate your ecclesiology, to call people to deeper community, to walk together on mission, and to engage the mission. So we can elevate our ecclesiology and engage the mission at the same time. Because mission is rooted in the identity of God himself. So God is on a mission. And if God is on a mission, our role is to join him, is to say, here I am, Lord, send me, is to join him on his mission in the world. So what does that mean for us looking forward? Well, I want to quickly go through some things to share some thoughts on that. And then I'm going to come back to this idea of elevating our ecclesiology and engaging the mission. Because again, I've dealt some with what's rocked the church and what's a path forward through elevating our ecclesiology. But also, let's talk some about the world. And the challenge with talking about the world is everything's true somewhere in the world. Actually, there's an old expression, everything's true somewhere in China. Someone says to me, in China, I think they think this way. And I'm pretty sure that somewhere in China, people think that way. But it's also true in an incredible diverse nation like India. But then you take the whole world, it's probably true somewhere. But let me talk about some ideas that we've seen around the world and walk through them. So I call them headwinds coming out of COVID. This relates to the mission part. So headwinds are things that slow us down. If we're walking and the wind's blowing in our face, it makes it harder to make the trek. If we're on an airplane and the wind's blowing against the airplane, it slows us down. So think in terms of when you're walking and you're hitting headwinds, it makes it harder to walk forward. So what are some headwinds coming out of COVID? Let's look at some of them. First is shrinking nominalism. Around the world, in most of the places, most of the time zones where people are listening, there's been some sense of people who call themselves Christians but are not really committed. What we're finding is there's less and less of those people. And those people were a lot of the people, like the back third of the church, those people were a lot of those people that we actually were able to engage. People who are Christians are committed to the Lord and walking with the Lord, but people who are sort of on the edge are becoming less and less common. And depending on where you are, that may mean they're moving to other faiths or to no faith. And that's one of the challenges. Another headwind is the attitude towards proselytizing. Proselytizing is the generic non-Christian word for evangelism. But around the world, depending on where you are, and some of you are in nations where proselytizing is illegal. Some of you are in nations where if somebody converts, there's lives in jeopardy. And some of your nations where just people don't like that. But the attitude towards proselytizing is generally not positive in most places. Now, the UN Declaration of Human Rights actually lists sharing your faith, proselytizing, as a fundamental human right. Because for some religions, not all religions, some religions it's just part of what they believe. And Christianity is one of those faiths. It's a missionary faith in a world that increasingly doesn't like missionary faiths, or they like missionary faiths if it's their own faith. So that's part of the headwinds coming out of COVID. Another headwind coming out of COVID is accelerating cultural shifts. The world's changing, and it seems to be changing faster in this year than it was 5 years ago and 10 years ago. And maybe that's always the case, but I think most people would say, everyone sort of feels like if you were living in 1900, you probably thought it was a breakneck speed of change compared to 1800. But everyone sort of agrees that the last few years has created acceleration of cultural change, turbulence and tumult like anything we've seen in a generation in many ways. Now, again, your situation might be different if you walk through the 80s in Brazil. Anyway, I won't go into all the examples, but accelerating cultural shifts are a reality. Another is the image of evangelicalism, and I'll use that term. Some people use that term, some people won't. But if you're in Korea right now, that impacts some things. If you're in Canada right now, that impacts some things. It impacts some things. Good image of Christians in India, that impacts some things. And the people that do things you don't want them to do, and I get that. But there we feel the impact of those headwinds. But let's talk about some tailwinds as well. So tailwinds are things that are sort of propelling you forward, right? So you don't want them too much to knock you over, blowing you from behind. But if you're in an airplane and you got a tailwind, you get there sooner. One of the things that we've seen is, and we'll walk through these, but all these kind of come under a bigger category. It's not working. Maybe 10 years ago, we thought it was going to work. This world was going to work out. Okay, but most people have sort of maybe learned a little better that things are getting better in some ways. COVID knocked us back on issues of hunger around the world. Substantially, hundreds of millions of people slipped back into poverty, into hunger and more. But if we look over the course of the last 3 decades, we've seen 1 billion people lifted out of extreme poverty. I mean, there's some forward progress, but then we see wars and division and brokenness, and that has caused some tailwinds. Let's look at a few of them. One is spiritual hunger. All around the world, when I talk to Christian leaders, one of the things I have the privilege of leading is I lead the region for Lausanne. Some of you are familiar with the Lausanne movement. Lausanne movement for world, events of world Christianity, the world events of the gospel, worldwide evangelization. And actually, L4 is now in the process of being planned in Seoul 2024, which I'm super excited. I think rightfully to be in Asia, for the North American delegation that I'll help put together, to be a voice in the chorus, maybe in the past where it was more the choir director, is a good thing. But when I get together with the other regional leaders, and there's less than 10 of us, and we have a WhatsApp channel, and I can actually look at it, and I do sometimes, and to see what they're saying here, I mean, people are feeling a spiritual hunger all around the world, in secular countries, and predominantly Muslim countries, and in places of animist religion and places of other faiths and more. I mean, I could just go through and I could read out loud to you some of these things, and it would, I think, really be encouraging to you. There is a spiritual hunger around the world that I think is what often happens in times like this. We can actually look back. There have been world tumultuous times before. The late 1800s birthed the Pentecostal movement around the world, with now 600 million people see themselves connected to spirit-filled movements, right? The fastest growing movement in the history of global Christianity is the Pentecostal charismatic movement of the last century. And again, that's not my tradition, but thank God for 600 million people who are now followers of Jesus. But that all started in a really tumultuous and turbulent time in the world. And we could go back and see this throughout history. The church historian Eusebius, if you studied church history at maybe Bible college or seminary, you probably heard of Eusebius, ran across Eusebius. He was the early church historian. He was like famous. I mean, I don't know what a famous historian looks like, but if there was one, it would be Eusebius. And Eusebius talked about during we don't know what the disease was, but a disease spread. I think it was the late 2nd, early 3rd century, and it spread throughout what was then the Roman Empire. And Eusebius wrote, and I'm quoting a translation from the English, he said that the Christians got involved and they served others. Actually, one of the emperors who didn't like Christians called them these impious Galileans. They were impious because they didn't worship the gods, and they were Galileans because of obviously Jesus. These impious Galileans, they served not only their own sick and poor, but ours also. It just drove these emperors crazy. Julian the Apostate was the one who said that. Again, his mother didn't name him Julian the Apostate, but he was called that later by church historians. But Eusebius writes about the Christians in this day, and actually talks about this, that the Christians, quote, deeds were on everyone's lips, and they glorified the God of the Christians. And I know that many of you are in places that I shouldn't mention on camera. There's so many places that I can mention on camera, that people saw what you did showing and sharing the love of Jesus in the last few years in a way that gave them a greater awareness, greater visibility, greater openness to the good news of the gospel. Sisters and brothers around the world, international friends, there's a spiritual hunger out there. And may we join Jesus on mission in the midst of it. The other thing is the failure of the modern experiment. It's just not working. The idea that we progress into greater and greater unity and peace just is not evident, and not, I think, a position that we can defend today. I think, and who knows, I'm pre-recording this, who knows what will happen between, I don't know if I should be talking about a greater war in Europe or Asia, if I should be talking about another outbreak, if I should be, wars and rumors of wars, the Bible speaks of, right? So this is the world in which we live. And I think people are feeling that maybe I need a different hope. My hope as a Christian is built on nothing less than Jesus' blood and righteousness. Maybe I need to build my house on the rock rather than my house on sand. So I think that's kind of the moment we're in, is this failure of the modern experiment. Deployment for mission is a key thing as well. Next on our list is deployment for mission. That front third, I think, is the key to the future. I know that seems strange, but if God's working in people in your church that have gotten engaged and involved at a greater level, I think you should, again, normalize that. Call the second third to engage more like that. Try to lift up rather than push back or revert back. And if the front third could help engage the second third to look more like the front third, we normalize the front third, we could engage again that missing third and beyond in our community and ultimately the world. So I think ultimately the deployment for mission is a key gospel opportunity that we need to be aware of and engage in. It's a key time. And then I want to come back finally to tumult and opportunity. An example that I use in where I am in the West, the late 60s was a really tumultuous time. And it wasn't the same. It's different in different places around the world. But there's a movement that was birthed out of that I'm a follower of Jesus today because of, not directly from that movement, but the people who came to Christ in that movement shared the good news of the gospel with me. In 1968, where I live, the world was sort of on fire. There were millions of people in the streets. There were protests and about war, and there was actually a pandemic that year. Back then they called it the Hong Kong flu. Today we call it H3N2. And yet from there, we actually saw the beginning of what we'd call today the Jesus People movement, which had a distinct impact on my nation and a lot of the Western world and in some places around the world as well. So I think with that tumult and the opportunity comes, well, a moment. And the moment we're in doesn't pause the mission we're on. So back to Esther. Who knows? Who knows? Perhaps you've come to your position for such a time as this. And that's a specific verse with a specific application, and it's not speaking about you. We all know that. But in God's sovereignty, this moment is not a surprise to the Lord. The tumultuous experience that many of us are experiencing in different nations around the world, God's at work in that. I'm not saying it's easy, but I'm saying that God is at work in the midst of difficult times. And I think our path to post-COVID multiplication looks similar and different in some ways. And again, it's very difficult to talk about what it looks like among the Pokot in Africa, the Quechua of the highlands in Peru, or among Malaysian-born Chinese. I mean, it's very complicated. And so as a missiologist, it would be foolhardy for me to say, and this is what it looks like for you. But I think we can say, and we can see, that in the midst of this moment, that God is still faithful. And out of moments like this often come significant gospel movements. So I told you already, I'm not discouraged, but I'm not saying it's easy. I think we're going to need reservoirs of resilience like we haven't had before. I think we're going to need a commitment to multiplication because sometimes the shock of the last few years, maybe your attendance has been impacted, your finances have been impacted, the shock of the last few years has maybe caused you maybe to pull back on some mission endeavors, maybe missionaries being sent or churches being planted. But I want to remind you that if you're watching this, you are a remarkably privileged individual. Not because you're watching me, but because you have technology that in the great century of missions, which is typically described as the late 1700s to the early 1900s, in the great century of missions, they didn't have any of this. We are all probably richer than many of the people who set across the world in boats, sometimes burned the boats, sometimes brought their coffins with them to show and share the love of Jesus in the midst of a broken and hurting world. If we're going to see the advance of the gospel the way I think we hope, the way I think we desire, it's going to be people who sacrifice, who join Jesus on mission, who don't allow the resource challenges to deter the gospel mission. But instead, they say, "Here I am, Lord, send me." So my encouragement to you in the midst of a really difficult time is to acknowledge that the Lord has brought us to this time. He is not surprised, and He wants us to send us on mission and to continue to find those pathways for multiplication for His glory and His honor. Let's join together in doing that in Friends churches, all different time zones around the world. Let's make much of Jesus through multiplication in our post-COVID reality. Thanks for taking the time to listen, and God bless.